Good evening, everyone. I should say late afternoon. It almost feels like spring. I think it does, except for our guest from California, who's freezing. Anyway, thanks so much for coming out tonight to the University of Rochester. We're delighted that you're here tonight. My name is Marianne Mavernack, and I have the privilege of being the Andrew H. and Janet Dayton Neely Dean of River Campus Libraries. Tonight is the final lecture of the 2015-16 season of the Neely series, which is provided and brought to us by Andrew and Janet Dayton Neely. The lecture is really a special one because we've co-sponsored it with our Neely series, the Humanities Center, and the Sarah Neinzeden Fund. We have truly enjoyed this collaboration, and it obviously is work because we have just an outstanding turnout tonight. Following tonight's lecture, David Peterson will be signing copies of his books, The Art of Language Invention and Living Language Dothraki. I knew that, and I just stumbled. Okay, both of which will be available for purchase right outside in the seminar room. Please be sure as well in the upcoming weeks and months through to July, we have an exhibit in the Robbins Library, which is on the 4th floor of the River Campus Libraries, which examines the long tradition of invented languages from St. Hildegard of Bingen's medieval lingua ignoto to Game of Thrones Dothraki. And now I'm going to have a mental block about it. The exhibit has been curated by Professor of English Sarah Higley, and it'll be on display, as I say, until mid-July. Speaking of Sarah, Professor Higley's research is in the areas of Old and Middle English, Celtic studies, and film studies. Her interests in the other world, featured in so many Welsh and Irish legends, along with the magical powers of the Celtic poet, has driven her to study fantasy worlds and languages both medieval and modern. She edited and translated the divine language created by the 12th century nun, St. Hildegard of Bingen, and in stolen hours, years ago, she wrote a teleplay to Star Trek, The Next Generation. Hollow Pursuits was about a shy lieutenant who recreated his fellow officers in that other world called the holodeck. And as luck would have it, she spent 3 years making animated films in an online virtual world, a new media holodeck. She shares with David Peterson an avid interest in linguistics and language invention. Sarah will be introducing our speaker tonight, and I'll turn it over to Sarah.
How's my sound? Thank you so much, Marianne, for that lovely introduction. I'm embarrassed now. It was a fortuitous conflict that brought two terrific sponsors together for me. I'm delighted to have the support of the Neely sponsors who joined forces with the Humanities Project in funding and helping me put this event together. Especially Marianne, Katie Festa, Marie Turner, Izzy Levin, Matt Balichet, and Joan Rubin of the Humanities Center, and of course Jenny Gilardoni and Sherry Gunter for helping me with the technicalities of this. I also want to thank my former student, Sarah Neinzeden, whom you mentioned, yes, who gave me a grant some time ago that I've long wanted to share with the university, and now I can do so. And thank you all for coming. David Peterson's visit today is part of a three-pronged project I conceived of last year. There is a documentary coming out later this year directed by Britton Watkins and Joshua Feldman about personal and artistic language invention, for which I was interviewed, and where I talked to David in Brooklyn when I did so. So I decided then, and this was just in the fall, that my present course this semester, Magic Language, could be part of two other productions. First, the exhibit that you so kindly mentioned, Language Architects Throughout the Ages, which is on display in the Robbins Library. And a second, a visit by David J. Peterson, who is the only language inventor I know who has made a sustained profession out of inventing languages for media entertainment, most famously Game of Thrones, but also Defiance, The 100, Emerald City, and other television shows. Before he became famous for doing so, though, I knew him when he was merely president of the Language Creation Society, which he co-founded some years back, and the conventions its members held, all right. The first one in Berkeley in 2006, and subsequently at Brown University, at the University of Texas, Austin, and in the Netherlands and the UK. And before that, I knew him as a conlanger on the listserv Conlang L, Constructed Languages, author of Megdevi and Kamakawi and a host of other colorful and elegant linguistic inventions, often illustrated in hilarious stories about mad kings and that sort of thing. I was impressed early on with David's imagination and intellect and sense of humor. David is a linguist with degrees from UC Berkeley and UC San Diego. He is author of Living Language Dothraki, and the Art of Language Invention, which is a rigorous introduction to linguistic principles for wannabe conlangers. And I have to tell you that I am so proud today to have been able to bring out, with everybody's help, this man who, along with others, has dignified and validated an artistic pursuit that for so long has been considered closeted, a secret vice, a vice, secret, a pathological, and has in some ways given it importance. And I think that this is an important step that we've made today in honoring it in this way. So David is going to speak to us today about new media linguistics, inventing languages for more than just Game of Thrones. And as they say in Dothraki, vo levos hat razef, don't tie your horse down. So don't tie it down. Be what you can be. David Peterson.
Works. Does it? Yes. Really? Like it's actually projecting me? Everybody hear me in the back? Cool. Even in the very, very, very back, the people I see on the wall. Yay! Oh, wait, you say so? Okay, hold on a sec. I think I can work with that. Just a second. Just 1 second. The button is not very sensitive. Wait a minute. Is it working now? Oh my God, yes. All right, cool. So, yeah, let's start this thing going here. I do kind of a fancy thing. Also, I have to remember to look to my left, not my right. So I'm going to stay on this side of the room so everybody gets the mic. Anyway, so, there, it's coming. All right. There's the title. Now that's done and we can stop thinking about it because I don't know what it means. This is me. That's me over there. That's my grandfather. That's my cousin. It looks like my sister, but it's not. My sister is actually 20 years younger than me. Pretty wild. My only sister, my only sibling. She's a high school freshman right now. Oh man, I wish that I should have put up a picture of her so I can embarrass her. Anyway, her name is Natalie Ishii, so that will embarrass her. Hopefully this will come out on the internet and she will cringe. I love it. I love it. She's in high school. She's so embarrassable. Anyway, so yeah, so that's me, and I've created a number of languages for different television shows. In the community, we call them conlangs. Conlang is short for constructed language, and it came out of the necessity for having a name for the listserv that was short. They said, well, it needs to be something at wherever it was going to be, and it needs to be a short word. They said, well, conlang, it's short for constructed language, and now it's in the Oxford English Dictionary. Crazy. Anyway, so I've created languages for Game of Thrones. I've created these guys, Dothraki, Valyrian, and I created a language for one line for this giant in season 5. I didn't know it was going to be that little. I thought it was going to be more, and it was funny. Even though it was only one line, one short line that I translated, they still cut it down. It was great. Anyway, so I also created languages for a show called Defiance, which is sadly canceled after 3 seasons. Anybody remember Defiance here? Oh, yay. You guys are awesome. I loved working on this show. Part of the reason is that they let me do so much stuff with it. Like they let me create writing systems that they used all over the place. They used on signage in the background. They used in a journal, which then the journal pages got sold afterwards when the show was canceled and it was put up on eBay. And so I bought them. I was like, I don't care. It's $330 well spent. I also created a language for a show called Starcross. This is all in chronological order, by the way. It was a language called Sondive. It would needed to be for young, sexy teens, so I gave it nasalized vowels like in French. Anybody watch Starcross? Wow, really? Hey, all right. It was pretty cool for one season. I created a language for Thor: The Dark World. I didn't actually create this script for the movie. I created it for the one fan of this language. There's like one fan. She was on Tumblr, who was a really big fan of the language, and so I basically created that script for her and uploaded the font. It doesn't appear in the movie anywhere. I created a language for Dominion, which only ran for a couple seasons. Anybody watch this one? Yeah, it was pretty cool. It was kind of edgy. There were some really great performances. The fellow who played David Wheel, man, it was something. Anyway, and then for this show, the 100, I came on season 2 and created a language called Trigeta slang. Any fans of the 100 in here? Yeah. Ironically, this is my most popular language, like by far. It way outstrips all of the others. Anything on Game of Thrones, this is the most popular one. I also created a small little language for season 2 of Penny Dreadful, which is the best show I've ever worked on and also the best show on in the air right now. You all should be watching Penny Dreadful. It is amazing. I love it. God, it's a great show. And she should be winning Best Actress at every single award ceremony ever for the rest of time. She's Ava Green, just shockingly good. Amazing show. And also I've got a new show coming out called Emerald City. Did I skip one? Hold on a sec. And that doesn't even tell me. Oh, that's a bummer. I skipped one. Okay, anybody watch the Shannara Chronicles? It was on for, it just had its first season. Yeah, I created a language for that show. And I had a little thing for it that said the name of the language. It was called Nolith. But anyway, Emerald City's coming out probably sometime this fall, I assume. They haven't set a release date for it yet. And I created 2 languages for that. All right, so as far as the history of created languages goes, it starts, as was mentioned, at least as far as we know, with Hildegard von Bingen, who was a German abbess. She did lots of stuff. There's a movie about her life that mentions everything except her created language, because why would it? Man, it's a German movie, but just shocking. Anyway, so it was lingua ignota. It was basically a vocabulary of about 1,000 nouns that she fitted to Latin grammar and she would use in music. That's the first recorded, that's basically the first recorded entry, I guess, we have, or evidence of somebody consciously creating anything even close to a language. And consequently, she has become the patron saint of conlanging, at least within the conlang community. This was in the 12th century. If my name were Sarah Higley, I could give you exact years, but I just know 12th century. Right? Mostly 12th century. There we go. There's actually kind of a little bit of, there are languages that pop up here and there hereafter for a couple of centuries that are also kind of religious in character. Either an outgrowth of kind of a glossolalia, speaking in tongues thing, or an attempt to record the language of angels, the original language, or some sort of a religious language like that. The next movement comes with the philosophical language movement. This is John Wilkins, I guess. And John Wilkins was one of the many philosophical language creators. He created a language that tried to carve up the entire universe so that you could look at a word or hear a word and know exactly what it referred to. The languages that they ended up producing, because there were several of this type, were very bulky and clumsy, and because like related concepts would all have very similar sounding words. It was rather impractical, and so these languages never caught on, but they were more scientific in nature. They were trying to capture something that nobody else could. And next, in the 19th century, we had the International Auxiliary Language Movement, the most famous of which is Esperanto, created by this gentleman, whose last name is Zamenhof, and whose first name is Ludwig Laser Zamenhof, yeah. And he created Esperanto in 1887. It was kind of a mishmash of a bunch of European languages, very regular. And his idea was that if everybody spoke this language, there would be world peace. It didn't quite work out, but actually Esperanto is probably the most successful created language in history if you measure it by the number of speakers. There are not only about 1 million speakers of Esperanto of varying levels the world over, but there are actually a number of native speakers, which I believe it's the only created language ever to have native speakers. And if you're wondering how this would happen, because I've met 3 of them, this is how it works. You have 2 people meet at an Esperanto convention, and they fall in love, and then skipping ahead a few steps, suddenly there's a child, and these 2 people only share one language, Esperanto. So usually what happens is these children grow up bilingual. As in the case of my friend Lana, they grew up in Russia, and so Esperanto was the language of the home, Russian was the language of public. And so, yeah, it's still incredibly successful. It would have been nice to have world peace, but we're muddying along, I guess. Anyway, and next in the 20th century, this was the advent of the artistic languages. This is J.R.R. Tolkien, who was a language creator first and then an author second. He loved language. He loved studying them. He was a philologist, and he loved creating languages. And when he was creating his languages, to him, it felt inauthentic because these languages existed, but there was nobody to speak them. And so he decided he needed to create a world in which these languages made sense, in which they existed. And so he created Middle-earth and The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings. Eventually those became really, really popular. And so he stopped playing with his languages as much, which was a bummer for the rest of us because lots of his language stuff is fragmentary. But for him, I think this is probably, unless I'm missing something, this might be the first recorded instance of somebody creating a language for basically artistic purposes. Everybody else had some sort of agenda, whether it was a religious agenda or a philosophical agenda or a political agenda, where he was just creating it for the pure joy of language. And that basically touched off what we have here in the rest of the 20th century. Lots of people were inspired by Tolkien, but others were inspired by other events. Like once Klingon came along, Klingon inspired a lot of people. Maybe some people were inspired by Land of the Lost. Did you know this? The first person ever to be paid to create a language was Victoria Fromkin, a linguist from UCLA, for the show Land of the Lost, which the older folks will remember is a really just terrible show. There was just like these people go down a waterfall and end up in a land where there's dinosaurs and then also other people about, there's a Dimetrodon that breathes fire. Why? I don't know. Dimetrodon is cool enough. I mean, have you seen it? It's got that thing. It's very cool. I don't know why you breathe fire. It didn't make any sense. But so in 1990, this listserv that I mentioned before, the Conlang listserv, that was really the first time that language creators met each other. If you go to Tolkien, for example, he talks about maybe overhearing somebody he thinks was a language creator once in his entire life, and he didn't make contact with this person because he didn't want to out him. Essentially, because language creation has often been looked on as a very bizarre activity because it's not usual. And if you think about language as purely utilitarian, yeah, you can see why it would be unusual. Why would you create a language that nobody speaks? But I want to explore today what it means to create a language for something other than a utilitarian purpose. Because I think the great, I've thought about this a bit, I think the great advancement of the conlanging community, those conlangers that found each other and started to share each other's work, is really the ultimate end goal of language creation, and that is purpose. Before, people were just creating languages because of whatever. Usually it was just like they thought this is the only thing that a language can possibly be, and so we're going to create it in this manner. Now, language creators very seriously think and answer the question at the very beginning, why am I doing this? And once you have an answer to that, then some of the constraints start to fall into place. So if you think about different types of beings, let's say that you had some sort of a cat-like being. This, by the way, is little Roman. He loves my daughter's crib. He's in it more than she is. He's a little beast. Oh, I miss him, so I'm going to see him tomorrow. So if your beings were something like this, you might have different types of proverbs. If your gods were like this, you might say different things, like something like this. Nifodir twelyenrem listeyeman. The gods have retractable claws. This is one of my favorite phrases from Teonath, the creation of Sarah Higley, one of my favorite languages of all time. If these are your beings, then you might find yourself creating something a little bit different. So this is what's known as a rikchik. You see, you got the big eye there. There's 49 of these tentacles, and you have these 7 little short ones that are white on the end. But you'll notice that they don't have any ears, and they don't have a mouth. So what would a language of theirs look like? Well, of course, it is a sign language that's signed with these 7 tentacles. So if you ask about, well, how do you speak it? You don't. There is no sound. So the creator of this language, Dennis Moskowitz, created a little writing system so that you could figure out basically how things are signed. These are like the ends of the tentacles, the part that you look at, and essentially they get telegraphed in real time. So from 1, 2, 3. So take a look at this guy. This is the insect eats the flower, right? And we have this part is like tells you what the word is. This is insect flower eat. And then everything around it changes. So here's the insect eats in the flower. Notice the difference. Flower from that to that. And now we flip it around. The flower eats the insect. And notice what happened. Look at this guy that looks like a little L and this guy that looks like a candy cane. Now compare that to that. And so that's what it is. And that's how he created this language, which is amazing. And again, you can't speak, but you can kind of use it if you use this orthography of his that he's come up with. So then the question of when you're working on a television show is like, what is an appropriate language for people like this? And I think that, or I guess people like this, because she's a non-native speaker, sorry. So I think a lot of people focus on things that, to me, as the language creator, aren't really relevant. So there's a lot made of the horsishness of Dothraki. Look at all those little animals. I hope they're happy. And that, they're kind of violent. Look at him. He's got these knives here. He's got a big bloody gash right there. They're so good. But that's really not important to me when it comes to creating a language. This is what's important to me. So these are human beings, yeah? So they still have the same mouths. They still got this little alveolar ridge. You can feel with your tongue, if you rub it across the back of your mouth, starting at your teeth, there's this little bump there that starts like right here. That's called your alveolar ridge. They still got that. They still got a uvula. They still have a larynx. They still do things like eat and sleep and are born and die. They still get together and procreate. They're human beings. And so what is appropriate for a human being? A human language. And so the question is, what makes a human language? What makes the languages that we speak different from something like a Ripchick, or different from something like an Esperanto, which is really super regular? And the thing that I focus on is, what the hell is this? Hold on a sec. Let's see where I'm going. Sorry, right. Okay. So then the question is like, so if you wanted to create a language, well, I guess you could, of course, just take a sentence like this and just make up one word for each of them. There we go. Take those roasting pigs off the fire. Ftuki jala tukaza guzoip, or whatever. And it's just one-to-one correspondence. And so what you've done here is you haven't created a language. You've created a really stupid way of speaking English. Because it's just one-to-one English, right? And you could even get a little more complex and say get rid of the and like flip the order of these things, but that's not really the way that our languages come to be. They don't come to be by just taking some other language and rearranging the letters a little bit or giving them different sounds. This is how they come to be. So this is the Proto-Indo-European tree here. Whole bunch of different languages. This is what we suppose the word for four was at some point in time. And it gave birth to all of these different words for four. Can anybody see their house from here? There's English, it's four. And so you can see how like these things kind of changed over the time. Like I guess this real innovation in moving into the Slavic languages was the loss of these W's. That's why you ended up with chitiri. That's not really how you spell it. Well, it's Romanized, whatever. Chitiri and lots of things like that in Slavonic languages. Over here, the KW became an F for some reason, and so we have all these different words for four. Four, vier, vier, vier. No, that one's Slavic. So this is basically how we get our modern languages, right? They start off as one thing. They change very gradually over the centuries as a whole bunch of different people speak them, and then they become something else, so that there's never a strong cutoff point, but at some point you can say, all right, this is now a language that the people speaking this cannot understand the people from thousands of years ago. And you can even see how gradual it is, where it's like, you know how we speak now, and if you pop in a movie from the 1930s, like My Man Godfrey, I'm just going to throw that out there because it's wonderful. Yeah, you can still understand everything. You find a couple of inconsistencies, little oddities, like apparently not knowing what a scavenger hunt is because they had to explain it, and also that what was in My Man Godfrey, the mother doesn't know the bizarre coinage buck for referring to money. It's like bucks. What are these bucks you're talking about? And she thinks she's talking about deer or something. So you can see that. Then, of course, you can go back to Shakespeare and see that, okay, things are getting a little tough here, but you can mostly follow along. Then you get to Chaucer, and things get quite a bit more difficult. You can do it with maybe a little primer at the beginning, but it's pretty tough. It's pretty tough. Then you go back to Beowulf, and there's just, you can't do it. You can spot things where it's like, all right, that looks like some word, and you might be right, but you can't read any of it. It's basically a different language that you have to learn if you want to be able to read it, which is why there are modern translations of Beowulf, which seems weird if you say, well, you're translating from English to English. It's like, well, technically, yes, but, you know, it's just because we didn't change the name. We didn't update it. We didn't call it Americanese, what we're speaking now. Americanese. Americanois. Ooh, I like this. All right, anyway. So moving on. So languages change over time. That's sometimes this can be news to people. If not, if you didn't know this, well, there we are. Languages change over time. It's great. It's one of the best things in the world. And so the question is, how do they change? They change, one of the things I focus on three areas. The sound, the meanings of words, the semantics of words, and the grammar, how that changes over time. So with sounds, for example, have you ever wondered why these things are pronounced the same but spelled so differently? And it's because they were pronounced differently. In fact, everything up there was actually pronounced at one time, so that you had nicht and knicht, where you pronounce the K right in front of the N. If that seems barbaric, it happens still. It's done in German and Russian still. The word for book in Russian is Kniga. The word for garlic in German is Knoblauch, which you might remember from anybody, the New York Yankees player, Chuck Knobloch. Yeah, that's our English version of it, Knobloch. Not the beautiful Knoblauch. I love it. So anyway, so this is, at one point in time, this was English, right? Nicht, knicht. Then we had some sound changes happen. First thing that happened was this. We lost this h sound, especially in this environment. We just lost it entirely. But then what happened is we lengthened the vowel almost as if we missed it. So it wasn't just, neat versus kneet. It was neat versus kneet. We pronounced it long like that. And then the next change that happened, I think I've got this right, is that we did lose the K. And so at this point in time, in the past, now they're pronounced the same. Now they're just homophones. All right. The last sound change to happen was the great vowel shift, where we took these long vowels and changed them a little bit. So long E became I. And so then we have night and night. And then that, ta-da, that's how that happened. But the problem was we started spelling these things way back when we still pronounced them differently, and we didn't update it. So that was, I don't know, not very smart on our part, because we have a really bizarre writing system. It's just almost offensive to think that we torture our children with this. Other languages have been much better at keeping up to date. like Spanish for the most part. Spanish is kept up to date. It's got a couple of things that are, at least if you're from Mexico, the double L and the Y are going to be pronounced the same. And the Z and the C and the S are all going to be pronounced the same, C before I. And then you have to figure out, I guess, if a word has an H in it, since nobody pronounces the H anymore. But otherwise, it's mostly up to date. English, not so much. And then, what's this? Oh, right. So there are further explanations. Every time you see something like this, these irregular plurals, there's always an explanation. It's an explanation that lies in the history of the language. Very similar one with like mouse, mice, goose, geese, just sounds changing. Things that used to be regular are no longer regular, but we talk about mice a lot, so we keep the irregular plurals around. Whereas some of the old irregular stuff we kick out. Anybody know the original past tense of to dare, the verb? Durst. Durst. Exactly. Durst. What a wonderful thing. I guess we just don't talk about daring a lot or having dared in the past a lot because nobody remembers Durst anymore. I kind of like that one. Actually, the only place we hear it is with that fellow Fred Durst. Yeah, that was groan-worthy. That was terrible. Anyway, so, all right, so that was sound changes and kind of the effect of those. We also have changes with word meaning. So everybody knows what this means. It might be a little bit of surprise to learn that it originally meant this. Silly originally meant basically happy, what happy means now. But it started to change its meaning very gradually. Started off as happy, and so they thought, well, who's happy? If you're happy, that means you're blessed, because of course. And if you're blessed, that means you're pious. If you're pious, that means you're innocent, and this is where the real change took place. Because who is innocent? Who among us is innocent? Why? Only the children. Children are born innocent. But what else are children? Well, they're harmless, I guess. I don't know why they had this meaning at some point. You know, a harmless little innocent child that can't beat you up, I guess. But children are also other things. So if you're harmless, you're weak. And then weak generalized to feeble-minded. And this is, I believe, that this is the definition that I think silly has in Chaucer. You know that book about Chaucer where essentially it's some elaborate plot for somebody to cheat on somebody else? Or did I describe every book of Chaucer in Canterbury Tales? Well, they refer to the husband, I think it's the Miller's Tale, they refer to the husband as Sally. I think it's spelled S-E-L-Y in that one. It's either S-E-L-Y or S-A-L-A-L-Y. Yeah, Sally. Yeah, various spellings. And they didn't mean like he was like, ooh, I'm so goofy. No. They meant that he was like kind of stupid and easily tricked. And that's why they used that word. But anyway, then from feeble-minded, they eventually got to our modern meaning of silly, which is now goofy. I think of the definition of silly as like those little inflatable guys at like, at like a used car lot that's, yeah. Those little wacky inflatable arm guys. So yeah, there are little stories like this that happen with all sorts of words. Some of them, as far back as you go, they always meant the same thing, like son, S-O-N. You go all the way back to Europe, Proto-Indo-European, as far as we can theorize. It pretty much sounded the same and meant the same thing. But some of them changed rather drastically. And we all have familiarity with this with slang, of course. Because when I was young, slang were things like, saying in quite earnestly, rad and radical and bad and even badical. Tubular, that never really made it, but like far out. Oh, no. Far out was more of a 60s thing, but you get it, like 80s. And then pretty soon people started saying sick, which I found bizarre. Just distasteful. I never understood that. These things are usually short-lived, but sometimes the changes just, happen, like with the word obnoxious. Oh my gosh, wonderful book recommendation called Write It Right by Ambrose Bierce, who you might know from doing the Devil's Dictionary and the Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge. He wrote a book in like 1900 something, I think it was 1919, saying people don't speak English right anymore, because everybody comes out with a book like this every so often. Here's a great big list of words that people misuse. And it's a wonderful, charming list. It's just like you look at it and your mind boggles. One of them was obnoxious. He was very upset at how people use the word obnoxious to mean annoying. Because what obnoxious was supposed to mean, according to him, was exposed to danger. So like a soldier out on a battlefield is obnoxious to mustard gas fumes, if I have the year right. It's like, you look at that and think, what? That's just not even in the realm of possibility anymore. So yeah, that's a fun one to just look at and chuckle. I'm sure somebody's going to write a new one this year that's going to be equally amusing 100 years from now. Anyway, the last thing is what we would call grammatical change. And the best example I can give you is this one, which I just think is so charming. So originally, perhaps somebody would say something like this: I go to London to eat. That is, I go to this place in order to do a thing. Pretty soon we had this innovation where you could cut out the destination and say, I go to eat. That's why I go right now. And then pretty soon the present progressive just killed the old present, and now this is our real present. I am going to eat. And then that's shortened up to I am going to eat, and then that's shortened up to I'm going to eat, and then shortened up to I'm going to eat, shortened up to I'm going to eat. Now we got I'm going to eat. There you go. The whole thing is just a schwa now. And have you noticed this too when talking about the future? It seems like we almost miss the go, like we don't hear it enough. So even more common than this is say, I'm going to go eat. It's like we just have to reintroduce this because it's like, where did our go? There it is. So, this kind of thing happens. We know where it came from, though, because we're all literate, right? We can remember where all of this came from. But you can imagine if there's a less than literate society, these changes happen, and pretty soon nobody remembers that there was anything there. It's just a little sound that how you do with the future until something else replaces it later on. Especially future tenses are really volatile. It seems like a new one is coming up every single, not century, but some unit of time where you can measure it by a new future tense coming along. I'll have to come up with a word for that. So, oh yeah, I put it in there. Oh, I put it in there. I forgot that I put it in there. Right, okay, anyway. So I wanted to give you an example of how I engage with all three of these things in one language. So we're going to start with Dothraki. We have in Dothraki, there was an older language that was created. You never see it on screen, but it was created because I needed to evolve from something, because you can't do it if there's nothing there beforehand. So in this older language, we had this word resi, with a nice hard like that. This sound is now gone from Dothraki. It was lost. Various things happened to it. It was the old word for woman. And what happened then was the r at the beginning became a ya at the beginning. And now this word means old woman only. It's not the usual word for woman. Chiori, which was the old word for girl, became the new word for woman to fill the blank. And so you think, well, what's the new word for girl? This is the new word for girl, nayet. It was the word for mushroom, a particular type of mushroom, a strawcap mushroom, if I got it right. And you think, oh, that's a little odd. Why is the word for strawcap mushroom becoming the new word for girl? Well, it's because in Dothraki culture, you'll notice that if you watch the show, the men and women both have long hair, or at least the men if they've been successful in battle. But what the men do is they braid their hair. As soon as they're old enough to braid it, they braid their hair, right? And they cut it if they lose in battle. So the men with nice long braids are ones that have been very, very successful. The ones with short hair are the ones that probably haven't been as successful. But really only the men braid their hair, not the women. And so if you think about what it looks like from behind, there's the neck, there's the hair, and there is your little girl. So this started off as a pet name that fathers and mothers would use with their daughters. They would call them, oh, my little mushroom. But then when this vacancy arose in the lexicon, this thing was graduated and became the word for girl. And that's how that happened. So another thing that happened is this is where this word came from. So originally in the old time, you have the chal, the leader, and the chal resi, who is the kind of the female kal, the wife of the kal. And then this thing kind of shortened up. You had chalyesi, and then you have chalyesi, like that. And that's where that word came from. And then this thing kind of became a semi-productive suffix that you could use. So we have vej is stallion. Vejesi is like a male stallion a female horse that's very aggressive, like a stallion. And then also we have these two words. Kolak is healer. Kolakesi is a female healer. because in Dothraki culture, the healers do different things depending on whether they are male or female. This was from the books, so I just filled in the gap there. So that's just kind of an example of what I do. Now, as far as how the work goes, how this actually goes with me working on a show, this is what I get. This is a script from season 3, episode 304. And so I will get a line that I'll need to translate. We'll focus on one line, Daenerys saying, "A dragon is not a slave." So what do I do to translate that? Well, first thing is you take this English, and a line of English comes with certain information that, that is particular to English. That is, these things are both singular. We know that because of the we have this is not here. It's a copula. We have these topic and comment linguistic words. And we have, of course, the meanings of them, because that also is carried through the actual meanings of what's being said there. So in translating this into High Valyrian, which is what I had to translate into, not Dothraki, we switched to High Valyrian, I have to take this information and then decide how that is going to be reified in High Valyrian. So first thing is the semantics. So that's pretty easy to get. So we have this word Zaldrizes for dragon. Is sagon, daor is a negator, and for slave we have dohairidos. And these words themselves come with a particular set of grammatical characteristics. These words, solar, there's a gender in High Valyrian. There are 4 of them, and they have different names. And each of them, they're nouns, they have declension classes. And with this bit here, it's like we know things that need to work in order for this to be conjugated properly. We need to know what the subject is and what its number is. And then because it needs to agree with that. And also there's a particular rule of High Valyrian that in negation you use the subjunctive rather than the indicative. Just a factoid about the way the language works. Also, it's the word order. So in Valyrian, we have to switch the word order. So subject, object, verb. And now we have to take all of this information and produce an actual sentence, right? And that's how we do it. So in this case, the words are the same because they're both in the nominative. That is, this is an is word, and so everything on either side, the topic and comment, are both in the same case, so they don't change. So that's nice. And then we have to translate this into the third person singular subjunctive. And so sagon becomes ixos. And then this is the ordering of these 2 elements. The negator comes at the end, very end of the sentence. We have it all put together, and that's what we get. Of course, each of these words have to come from somewhere. And this is something that I have to do. It's part of the process. So we have Zaldrizes. So you can take a look at these guys and guess where it came from. Little burn lizard, dragon, rawr, I love it. And so for the word for slave, we start with this word, dohairagon, which might be kind of familiar because the 4 words really of High Valyrian from the books are Valar morhulis, all men must die, and Valar dohairis, all men must serve. That's that same word, to serve. So that's the infinitive in the present tense. You can also have an infinitive in something that I call I call it the aorist, but it's really more of a habitual type of thing. To serve habitually. It's like not in reference to time. It's to just do it all the time. So dohairigon is to serve habitually. You can turn that into a participle. Dohairide, this is an adjective that you can describe something that is serving habitually. And then you can form a nominalization off of this participle and get dohairidos, one who serves habitually. And that's the word for slave in High Valyrian. So that's how those words came to be. But that's actually not the end of the process. In fact, that's not the actual translation. And here's why. So this would be the sentence, Zaldrizes dohairidos ixos daor. But that's not what Daenerys says. And this is why. So here we have this gentleman. And what's happened up to this point in Game of Thrones is this fellow on the right is named Krasnys. And he speaks a language called Astapori Valyrian, which is descended from High Valyrian. There's a relationship approximately the same as the relationship between, let's say, Vulgar Latin and Old Spanish. So close, but still a little different. All right. Daenerys speaks High Valyrian fluently, but we don't know this in the show. She's pretending that she doesn't. she actually understands everything this guy is saying. She's familiar with a lot of the descended versions of Valyrian. So even though this is a new one to her, it's pretty easy to just pick up on it. So she gets everything that he's been saying. And what he's been doing, because she's been trying to purchase an army from him, an army of slaves, in fact. And so she's trying to get a good price to get the whole army. He's just been insulting her up and down the whole time in Astapori Valyrian, just calling her the worst things possible. And through a translator, the translator, of course, been just translating the content, not saying the not nice things. And Daenerys has been pretending that she doesn't speak any of this. She doesn't understand. It's just like, okay, just takes whatever the translator says at face value. But all the time she's been hearing this. And so this sentence is how she reveals to him that she speaks Valyrian. So I wanted to do something a little different, because this guy speaks essentially the descendant of a Creole of High Valyrian, between High Valyrian and a language called Giscari. This guy is from the Giscari Empire. The Giscari Empire was destroyed by the Valyrians, who implanted their government, implanted their language, and so there was a kind of a Creole situation. The whole thing eventually became a new language, and so now they speak this form of Valyrian, right, where they have lots of Valyrian vocabulary, but they've taken up some old Giscari vocabulary for specific functions. Since the seat of the slave trade is here, they actually use old Giscari words for slave-specific terms. So like their word for name, the Valyrian one, broji, is the word for name. The Giscari word, gadbag, is the word for slave name, because they give slaves a different name when they enslave them. But it just meant name in Giscari. Similarly, they use their own word for slave, buzdar. And it looks like this. So this is the Valyrian term, dohairiros. This is the Giscari term, buzdar. And so it was borrowed into Astapori Valyrian. And when they have borrowings, they typically put this E on the end. So arach from Dothraki becomes arachi, and buzdar becomes buzdari, like that. So what I want you to do, so then this is the change that I made. I decided to just take out dohairiros and put in buzdari. And I did this for a very specific reason. I wanted her to use his word for slaves so that it would make the impact all the greater, that she really understood everything he's been saying the entire time, that he's been insulting her up and down. She wanted him to know that she understood, and this was how she decided to do it. So we are going to watch this scene. You notice that the translator, who's played by Natalie Emanuel, you notice that she notices right away. Yeah, she didn't have to wait. I mean, the other guy's handling a dragon. But I thought, since we were talking about the idea of, since this Game of Thrones is an adaptation, I thought it might be interesting to just take a look at what this scene looked like in the book. Yeah, here we go. Because things are a little different, and it's actually kind of interesting. So up here at the top, we have this point where Daenerys has taken the whip and is now going, she's actually on a horse and is going to the Unsullied. And we don't get any indication that she's speaking Valyrian here, but she says a lot of stuff. You know, it is done, you are mine, you are the dragons now, you're bought and paid for, it is done, it is done. I've noticed that George R. R. Martin is very, very subtle. Whereas the show probably can't afford to be as subtle as he is. So here's how you know she's speaking Valyrian. She glimpsed old Grazdan, that was the older man that looked back after the translator, turn his gray head sharply. This is her thinking, he hears me speak Valyrian. That's how you know that she's speaking Valyrian up here, which you can do in a book. You don't actually have to hear it, you can just say, they said this and it was Valyrian. You can't really do that in a TV show unless you have like a narrator, which you don't really have. Anyway, so then later, this was the line, and this is how this reads. So I think it's somewhere down here. The slaver basically says the same thing. You know, tell that woman her dragon won't come. And she says, there is a reason. A dragon is no slave. And immediately after that, and Dany swept the lash down as hard as she could across the slaver's face. He screamed and staggered back, the blood running red down his cheeks into his perfumed beard. He has no beard in the show. The harpy's fingers had torn his features half to pieces with one slash. But she did not pause to contemplate the ruin. Drogon, that's her dragon, she sang out loudly, sweetly, all her fear forgotten. Drakaris. And then the dragon spread his wings and roared and fire and put fire down on Krasny's. So one of the things that I loved about the adaptation from the book to the show is that they kind of made it the whole point about the language. It wasn't just this revelation and suddenly she's whipping this dude. Like, they give him a moment and the audience a moment to appreciate the fact that he has been thwarted. It's not just immediately he's being beat down. She wants him to know that she understood everything he said and wants him to figure out that she speaks the language. I thought that was a beautiful bit of adaptation from book to show. Though I mean, the book, of course, is equally great. Because I remember when I was originally reading this, and I'm going on with all these things, I'm like, wait a minute, this guy just agreed to trade his entire army for one dragon? Well, what's to prevent her from taking the dragon back? That's just so stupid. And then I was like, oh, good, she did it. Yeah. It was grateful. Anyway, so this is basically what my job is like, you know, what I do, what I did for fun before Game of Thrones and what I now do as a job ever since. And since I thought it was worth commenting on, because everybody always talks about, well, what's the purpose of an invented language, and then, you know, there are real languages about. The point here is that the created language is an art piece. In this case, it was created for this purpose, to be spoken in the show, to be a realistic part of the backdrop. And it's not like, you know, a set prop, because a language is as real as when you hear it, right? The Iron Throne just needs to look iron on the screen. A language, the second you hear it, you can take it down and there it is. I mean, a language is not like a box or a sword. And so when it comes to, let's say, the relationship that language creators have between natural languages, those that occur here on Earth, and linguistics, for example, I really like this as an example. These are studies by Leonardo da Vinci. These two are about horses. These are all about the human body. He just had pages and pages and pages of this stuff, studying how muscles work together, studying, you know, how the bone structure worked. And, you know, look at that. I don't even know what that is up in the brain there. And, you know, this, of course, is one of the most famous. And the idea is that he did all this study because he wanted to eventually be able to produce art that was more realistic, something like this. So the idea is that that's what we're doing. We study natural languages. We focus a lot on them. We pay a lot of attention to them. We study linguistics in order to get a better understanding of what it is that makes the languages that we have here on Earth, what makes them realistic, what makes them natural, and what can we do to try to emulate that when the most appropriate type of language you need for a piece of art is a language that should be realistic, one that should not strike a linguist as odd or bizarre, aside from the fact that it seems to have words for dragons in a world where there actually are dragons. You know, that's a little bizarre, but that's a part, you know, that's a part of the fiction. The language has to be as real as the humans are. And so that's what I do. You can find me on here online. Thank you very much. How are we doing now? Oh, good, 7. All right. And then, sorry, go ahead. Yeah, if anybody has any questions about anything, any show, any part of the process, feel free to ask them now. But also, you don't have to stay if you don't want to. Okay, yes, right in the middle.
Excuse me.
Wait, what?
Oh,
I'm sorry.
So we're going to have the reception that was planned for this room because there are so many people. It's going to be across the hall in Wiles Brown, and that's where we will be having book sales and signing of books after the questions.
Okay.
So let everybody know.
And just in case if nobody heard that, yeah, signing is now going to be across the hall when the question and answer session is done. Okay. Yes?
Who teaches the actors how to speak the created language?
Well, two things to that question. First, of course, the actors don't learn anything about the language. They just, because I record every single line of the show, of all the shows, on MP3, and then I send them to the script coordinator that makes sure they get out to the appropriate actors. And the ones that do the best basically listen to what I say and repeat it exactly. The ones that are the shakiest are the ones that don't do that. but if any actors need instruction, they generally get a hold of me over Skype or on the telephone. Or if they're in the LA area, I go to them. But I discovered, to my dismay, that usually the actors that need the least help contact me the most, and the ones that need the most help never, ever contact me. Kind of a shame. Yes, hello.
You mentioned a couple times there were a couple words in the books that you had as kind of a starting point for Game of Thrones.
Yeah.
Was it kind of easier having that base to work off of, or do you prefer kind of making it completely up on your own?
It's different. It's a different challenge, the fact that I had material in the books first for Game of Thrones. It's not like one is easier or one is harder, because I mean, if ultimately your language is going to have 10,000 words, I mean, what does it matter if you start out with 5 versus 0? It's just a different challenge. So like with the books of Game of Thrones, I had to make sure that everything that I was creating, once I was done, everything in the books should still be canon, Not like I could say okay, now that I've created this language, everything in the books is wrong. No. It couldn't work like that. So that was a challenge, because I had to make sure that first everything was consistent, which it was, which was nice, and then make sure that the phonology fit it, the sound system fit it. And then, but it did kind of constrain the language in that, the language that was, the Dothraki language that I saw in the books was basically Indo-European in structure. That is, separate nouns, separate verbs, minimal inflection on the ends of these things. So okay, we're going to do that, and not, a different language like, a Inuktitut that has, huge long words and noun incorporation, or Swahili that has much, much bigger verbs and then no marking on nouns, except for number and class. So yeah, I wouldn't say it was harder or easier. It was just different.
One thing is a sort of follow-up question to the first question is, I can speak louder.
I can also repeat the question. Go ahead. Yeah.
So a lot of people who come from English-speaking countries struggle with the sounds of existing natural language.
Yeah.
So, for Britain or America, chances are you're going to struggle with, say, tones or translation. Did you have to sort of make your constructed languages more like an Indo-European language to accommodate the actors, or did you make the actors accommodate you?
Okay, so the question is, because a lot of the actors are going to be native English speakers and monolingual English speakers likely, did I have to first tailor the language? Of course, no. I mean, they don't know anything about the grammar, so it doesn't matter. They just need to pronounce it. But the sound system, not for the actors, but for the producers, because they're the ones that have the say-so. So if they say, well, we want it to be easy for the actors to pronounce, I roll my eyes and think, okay, well, we have a gigantic IPA that exists, but it looks like I'm only going to be working with a quarter of it, and having to try to make it sound different from the other projects that I've done for producers that say, make it easy to pronounce for the actors. But then sometimes the producers say, oh, we want it to sound really different. They really don't even, and sometimes if they say, we want it to sound this way, we want it to sound really interesting, really different, they don't care about the actors. They say, just go. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Probably the hardest sound in Dothraki is like the uvular, the voiceless uvular stop, ha, ha. It's like how you should pronounce Iraq is Iraq with a nice Q at the end. But if you think about when that fails, provided they're listening to it, it's going to fail as a K, so that's close. I've never done a tone language for a television show and probably won't, because I think if tone fails, it is much more noticeable and it just sounds awful. So I, not even if I were on set every single day for every single take, would I do a tone language. I don't think that it would ever come out right. So that's something that's off the table. Probably realistic click systems too. Clicks are like, and these sounds exist in a lot of languages in South Africa. But it's not as if it's just those sounds. These sounds occur in series, so it's like voiced click, voiceless click, aspirated click, palatalized click, all this stuff. And there's like it's going to be enough to get them to do one, let alone this realistic range. So there are certain things that I won't do, but for the most part, I try to make it as interesting and non-Indo-European-y as possible, at least the sound system, as much as I can get by the producers. But that means I usually can't use ch for some reason, because they're really biased, either in favor of the sound if they want a harsh language, or against this sound if they want a pretty language. It's nonsense. But yes?
How many of your languages are
How many of my languages?
real?
Natural languages? How many natural languages am I familiar with? If you ask it in precisely that way, probably more than 20. Those are the ones that I've spent time studying. If you're asking fluent, not that many, but that's what I do for fun. I just study natural languages. Right now is Finnish. By Finnish, I am going to try to learn to at least some semblance of fluency, because I made a bet I'm going to be interviewed live at a convention next year in Helsinki in Finnish. So I'm doing my best right now. Yes.
What was the time frame for creating the languages for Game of Thrones, and then how much extra time did it add rehearsal time to getting the actors to be ready for a shoot?
Yeah. So how long it takes to create a language, again, depends on the project. Language creators working on their own can spend anywhere from 6 months to their entire life, and that's fine. With Hollywood, I tend to get 2 to 3 months. Game of Thrones was a different process because it was a competition, which was just kind of a nightmare. But we had about a month and a half for that. The smallest amount of time I've ever had was 2 weeks. That was on Star-Crossed, and I had to. Basically, what suffers there is the documentation. So I can't write all that stuff down. I just have to do it and then hope I remember it later on. So that was an unfortunate one. But yeah, no, it doesn't add any rehearsal time because, again, production doesn't. They don't care as much. They just say, "All right, this is it. Do it." And if you want to be an actor, you better do it. Game of Thrones, they get a lot of leading time though, which I think is great. I usually get the scripts somewhere in end of June, mid-July. I get all of them at once, which is outstanding. I take a couple weeks to do the translation, send them on. They don't even start filming till like October. And so they get a wonderful amount of time. It is not that way on other television shows. Sometimes it's like, okay, here's the script, translate it, give it over the next day. It's like you've got a week. So, do it. Yes?
How many mutations would you say one of your proto-languages goes through before it becomes something you can actually work with?
Okay.
Do you usually just go one and then write something else, or do you take it through several steps?
Okay, yeah. How many permutations do the proto-languages go through? It depends. Usually it's just one, especially when you don't see the proto-language. In the case of something like Valyrian, it would have been 3, because there was the proto-language of High Valyrian, then High Valyrian itself was the proto-language of the next one. But usually it's like I go back far enough from whatever the time I need to get enough of a change. But of course, that's also an odd question because of how language works. If you think about the evolution of English, say from Beowulf to now, at what point in time do you say, okay, now it's different, and here it is?
Well, you said before, when the speakers of one couldn't understand the speakers of the other, they kind of become distinct.
Kind of, but then that assumes, we can still do pretty much Shakespeare, right? Then that would assume that, the English from Shakespeare to now is the same, and the grammar was the same. It was different. Just because we can understand it doesn't mean it's not different. This thing, it changes incrementally over years. So anytime you produce a grammar of a language, I don't care which one it is, it's a fiction. It's like this is a snapshot of the language from some period in time that we're fixing for this thing that is, by its very nature, not fixed. So, theoretically, from Proto-Plains to Dothraki, theoretically there could be any number of languages in between there. It's just I felt that was the most relevant point to start and then move forward. Back.
kind of going off of that, that languages change naturally, do you expect or hope that some of your languages will, like, once you're done with the project, kind of go on in the wild? And by that, I mean you have enough students of your language that it'll change on its own.
Oh, okay. So do I hope that people will pick it up and like learn Dothraki and then it'll change on its own? This is going to sound like a callous answer, but no, I don't care. I mean, but here's the thing. It's like when I produce something like, you know, Dothraki or Valyrian, it's like that was the art piece, right? It's like, you know, there it is. And if people want to pick it up and learn it, that's great. In fact, if another conlanger in the future wanted to derive something from it, that would also be fine. I have the sense that if people started to pick it up and use it and became fluent, that there might be a little hesitation in allowing it to evolve. Because this is actually what we've seen with Esperanto. You can definitely tell differences in the way that, like, you know, these native speakers speak and then the non-native speakers who learn it as a second language, but they tend to try to teach it out of them by the time they get to, like, being a teenager, because within the community, they want the language to be exactly the same as when Zamenhof created it. It's an external pressure that really doesn't exist in our natural languages, but also, like, even when they try to do that, even when the Académie Française tries to, you know, crack the whip on people, they still say le parking, you know, because people are just going to do what they do. But part of the reason that somebody actually goes to the effort of learning to speak Esperanto is because they love the project, they love the idea, and so they try to keep it the same. I suspect that something like that might happen if there ended up being, you know, pockets of people who wanted to speak Valyrian or Dothraki. They would try to resist change. Even if I was still alive and said, no, don't do that, because it'll be really interesting, they might still not. So that's my suspicion. Yes?
You alluded to it earlier, but how did you get the gig for Game of Thrones?
It was a competition, the way I got the job for Game of Thrones. It was announced to all the language creation communities, but there were, but it was in order to do the job, it was a lot of work. So there were some people that decided to do it, looked at the application and dropped out. There were lots and lots of people in the community that did not take it seriously, because we didn't advertise, you know, create the LCS didn't advertise create the Dothraki language for Game of Thrones. It was create a language for a television show. And so lots of people just thought, well, this is obviously a joke, because that doesn't happen. It never happened. Like, nobody ever sought language creators. It was always like, oh, we need a language for this. Who are you? And like, well, I think I studied Spanish in high school. Great, you do it. You know, that type of thing. Never in history before they specifically sought language creators to create a language. And so because of that, people thought, well, it's got to be a hoax. Either that, or it's going to be for some, like, you know, like public access television show in Czechoslovakia. No, wait, I'm sorry, Czech Republic. Where is my head? I'm an 80s child. In the Czech Republic, you know, something like that. So there were a lot of people who just didn't even bother. And then once it was announced, they were like, oh, geez, this is something that could be a big deal, especially because it was a book series that already had a ton of fans, and it was on HBO. I think the fact that it was on HBO lent it a lot of immediate credibility, just because HBO always puts on good stuff. I mean, they just come off The Sopranos and True Blood, I mean, which were huge. So.
What made you do it, though? Like, how
Sorry.
come you didn't think it was a hoax?
Oh, well, because, no, I wasn't going to pass up an opportunity to create a language for TV. I don't care what it was. No, I was going to get that job, and I did. Hey, way in the back, look.
Yes, I was wondering, I was curious how you discovered your enthusiasm for creating a language, and maybe talk about the first language you ever created for fun.
Oh, yeah. The very first language I created was terrible. That's the way it goes with these things. Usually your first language is terrible. And then you do one of two things. You give it up, or you kind of change it later on. I think this is what Professor Higley did. And she goes, what age were you when you started creating Tiana? 10. 10 years old. So you can imagine you don't know a lot about language at 10. But it's like as she learned more, she just changed it. You know, same thing with my good friend Doug Ball, who created Scara when he was in junior high. And the language now looks nothing like it did in junior high.
He was here.
And he was, oh, that's right, of course, Doug Ball. He was a graduate at the University of Rochester. He was an undergraduate here. Yeah, and then he went on to get his PhD at Stanford, and now he's a professor at Truman State University, where he teaches a course on created languages. It's amazing. So yeah, my first language came from, I was studying a lot of languages at UC Berkeley. I went in as an English major because that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to teach high school English. And then I was taking a bunch of languages, so my first 3 semesters, I took 2 semesters of Arabic, a semester of Russian, a semester of French, and a semester of Esperanto. It was a student-taught course. That's where I met the native speakers. Later, I took Middle Egyptian because how would you not take a course and learn how to read hieroglyphs? Oh my God. You can't get that at every university. So I also took a linguistics course in my 3rd semester, introductory linguistics course. I never heard of it. I was not interested in it at all because I thought, oh, they just study language abstractly. They don't learn the language. What's the point? But I did it anyway because it fulfilled a breadth requirement and because my mother really prompted me. And in this course, a wonderful just intro course taught by Sam Chombo, it was just like revelatory. It's like, oh my God, this is so much fun. And the homework were just these worksheets with language data. They were basically games, little puzzles. And I was like, this counts as homework as opposed to reading novels and writing papers? This is amazing. So I immediately took it up and I added linguistics as a second major. And it was in my very first linguistics course that I created my first language. I just independently created the idea. A lot of language creators did in those days. Independently created the idea of creating my own personal language as opposed to an international one like Esperanto. And I started right there. I just started writing it down in my notebook. It was really bad. I made a regularized version of the templatic morphology of Arabic. If you haven't studied Arabic, you should. It's an amazing language. I absolutely fell in love with it when I studied it. The grammar is so different from anything that you've ever seen, and it's amazing. So I made it a kind of a regular version of that, and I created a script that obviously borrows a lot from Arabic. And like, it was terrible. Like, I had separate words in this language for sailor and mariner. Just think about that. I mean, obviously, there's a reason why we have these words in English, and it has to do with the history of our language and where we borrow words from. But it's not like they're different things. Yet in this language, they were completely different concepts. Because that's the way you think about it at the beginning. You're like, all right, well, they're different words in English. They should be different words in this language. After a while, though, after finding the constructed languages list and finding all of these other amazing conlangers, and also studying more linguistics, I slowly came to the realization of what I was doing. That even though I had kind of a funky grammar here that was doing some neat stuff, I was basically re-encoding the lexicon of English. I wasn't really creating anything. And that was kind of a really deflating moment for me. And so, because it was actually a pretty big language. It had several, like probably 5,000 to 6,000 words this language did, this first one. But I realized at that moment that in order to fix it, I would have to tear everything out by the roots. And I was like, well, what's the point? I mean, it's dead now. And so I stopped working on that, and I created a new one where I got a little bit better until I realized that I was still making mistakes. So I created a new one and got a little bit better. And I just kept on like this and just kept going until eventually the Game of Thrones job came along. And I think at that point in time, I was finally ready to do something that I could actually be proud of. But I needed that education, both from linguistics and from the language creation community, to figure out what it was that I was actually doing. So that's how that went. Blue hair.
I was just wondering, for like the show Defiance, they had a couple times where they use your languages in songs. And I was wondering how that was different. And also, what are some universities that have good linguistics programs that you think are just totally out of this world amazing?
Oh, man. Well, I guess I should say the University of Rochester. Because here we are. There is a linguistics program here, so if you're here, I mean, go to it. But okay, so she asked about the songs in Defiance. All right. let me tell you, translating a song was by far the worst part of my job ever from any show. It was terrible. I translated more than 20 songs. And in fact, I even wrote some of the lyrics to some of those songs in Defiance, which actually was cool because then I got credit and I actually get royalties from them through ASCAP. I was like, haha, one place I do. But so translating the song, what would happen is I would get these lyrics, whether it was a real song or lyrics that the showrunner would write. They send me these lyrics in English that rhymed and scanned, and say, okay, the guy who's writing the song, he needs this by tomorrow. And it's like over 30 lines. I'm like, are you kidding? It was an absolute nightmare. Because he also said, oh, and if you can make it rhyme too, that would be great. Oh God. So it was a nightmare. I was grateful that I developed a great working relationship with Brendan McCreary, the little brother of Bear McCreary. Bear McCreary did all of the orchestral stuff. Brendan McCreary ended up doing all of the songs. He was great at pronouncing my languages too. So I could create something with him, and we had a little way of notating where it's like, if you can, please include this syllable, but if you can't, you can clip this syllable. And that's how I'd have to do it. I would just like try my best to make the words short if I didn't have them. If I did have them, I could see if I could get away creating a synonym. If not, I would see, okay, how much can I clip this? Can I cut off this last vowel just in the grammar because it's being sung? So you get the last resort was changing the meaning of the song and just not saying anything. I'd try to get it close, but oh my God, like the worst part was translating the song Doll Parts by Hole. You know this song? This is the first stanza. I am doll mouth, doll eyes, doll legs. That's 8 syllables. 8 syllables, because you can do that in English. You can't do that in most languages. Think about trying to translate that into Spanish. What would you do? What I ended up having to do was I just kept putting off a line. So like the first line was I am, that was fine. Second line was dolls, possessive. Next line was mouth. Next line was eyes, and that was the end of the stanza. Then I pushed legs to the beginning of the next stanza and moved the line down until I got to a line where I was like, okay, now I can do this short. So that's how I did it. It was a nightmare. But I mean, I'm glad it happened. And then they didn't use it. They didn't use my translation at all. They just heard and said, no, let's just do the English. Oh, God. Oh, yeah, that happened. More than once. But sometimes the result was great. Anyway, so great linguistics departments. If you find yourself not at the University of Rochester, definitely recommend UC Berkeley. Loved it there. Outstanding department that also does historical linguistics, which I believe they do here, yeah? Historical? Is that here? I forget. A little bit.
It was one of our students said that she wanted to take
Yes, that's right, okay.
She's going to make a major out of it.
There you go, make a major. So yeah, UC Berkeley is great. They have a great focus on historical there, and there's also a great cognitive science department there. Same with UC San Diego, though the cognitive science and linguistics department aren't as connected any longer. Stanford is great. University of Chicago, of course. Then there's there are places like UPenn, and you can tell my California bias because I also want to say UC Santa Barbara and UC Santa Cruz. It also is beautiful there. Like honestly, it's so warm there. It's so nice. We have wonderful beaches. Anyway. But those are some that come to the top of my head. And then depending on your theoretical bent, there are even more. You can talk about places like MIT, Harvard, NYU, and Rice is another I've heard about. So.
We have questions. We have room for one more question because the bookseller is going to leave.
Oh, okay. Who has the best question? Yes.
What is your process for making the original script in a language that's not transliterated?
What do you mean?
So, like...
Oh, the writing system?
Yeah, the writing system.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I figured I didn't have time to go into that. But the cool thing is that, so you know how I've talked about how to create a writing system is when I talk about language evolution, Language evolution is enormous. The way that our languages evolve, I mean, there are thousands of them. Languages are always borrowing from one another. There are different populations coming in and taking up a new language. It's impossible to perfectly emulate that. But I believe that you can actually emulate rather perfectly the evolution of a writing system. It's a very small system. And we also, unlike with language, where we don't know what language was like when man first spoke, we do know how writing systems emerged. We see that it starts off with pictographs, and then we know various ways that it actually gradually moves to something else. So when I create a writing system, if it's close enough to that period in time, I will start with the pictographs. If not, I'll move it up a little bit and at least just start with some sort of a system written on stone. And the greatest part when you're evolving a writing system is three things really contribute to its change. One is a change in the medium that you write on. Another is a change in what you write with. And then it's the entire system usually getting borrowed to another language. That's how the alphabet happened. Greek found a whole bunch of letters that they didn't have a use for, but no letters for vowels. So they took all those letters they didn't have a use for and just made them vowels, which was a wonderful little insight. But so you can actually model that evolutionary process. You can even get all of the materials and do it. Like, you can chisel stuff into stone if you want. It's a little tough, but you can also get different types of paper, different types of brushes, and you can actually write this stuff and see how it evolves naturally and imagine how it would be done if people were doing it for years and years and years and years, keeping in mind both how it's written and what's easier, and also legibility, making sure that you can actually read it. So that's the process I go through when creating these systems. What you saw up there, like on Defiance, that was the end result. All the work is in my notebooks. Thanks.
Good evening, everyone. I should say late afternoon. It almost feels like spring. I think it does, except for our guest from California, who's freezing. Anyway, thanks so much for coming out tonight to the University of Rochester. We're delighted that you're here tonight. My name is Marianne Mavernack, and I have the privilege of being the Andrew H. and Janet Dayton Neely Dean of River Campus Libraries. Tonight is the final lecture of the 2015-16 season of the Neely series, which is provided and brought to us by Andrew and Janet Dayton Neely. The lecture is really a special one because we've co-sponsored it with our Neely series, the Humanities Center, and the Sarah Neinzeden Fund. We have truly enjoyed this collaboration, and it obviously is work because we have just an outstanding turnout tonight. Following tonight's lecture, David Peterson will be signing copies of his books, The Art of Language Invention and Living Language Dothraki. I knew that, and I just stumbled. Okay, both of which will be available for purchase right outside in the seminar room. Please be sure as well in the upcoming weeks and months through to July, we have an exhibit in the Robbins Library, which is on the 4th floor of the River Campus Libraries, which examines the long tradition of invented languages from St. Hildegard of Bingen's medieval lingua ignoto to Game of Thrones Dothraki. And now I'm going to have a mental block about it. The exhibit has been curated by Professor of English Sarah Higley, and it'll be on display, as I say, until mid-July. Speaking of Sarah, Professor Higley's research is in the areas of Old and Middle English, Celtic studies, and film studies. Her interests in the other world featured in so many Welsh and...
So I decided then, and this was just in the fall, that my present course this semester, Magic Language, could be part of two other productions. First, the exhibit that you so kindly mentioned, Language Architects Throughout the Ages, which is on display in the Robbins Library. And a second, a visit by David J. Peterson, who is the only language inventor I know who has made a sustained profession out of inventing languages for media entertainment, most famously Game of Thrones, but also Defiance, The 100, Emerald City, and other television shows. Before he became famous for doing so, though, I knew him when he was merely president of the Language Creation Society, which he co-founded some years back, and the conventions its members held, all right. The first one in Berkeley in 2006, and subsequently at Brown University, at the University of Texas, Austin, and in the Netherlands and the UK. And before that, I knew him as a conlanger on the listserv Conlang L, Constructed Languages, author of Megdevi and Kamakawi and a host of other colorful and elegant linguistic inventions, often illustrated in hilarious stories about mad kings and that sort of thing. I was impressed early on with David's imagination and intellect and sense of humor. David is a linguist with degrees from UC Berkeley and UC San Diego. He is author of Living Language Dothraki, and the Art of Language Invention, which is a rigorous introduction to linguistic principles for wannabe conlangers. And I have to tell you that I am so proud today to have been able to bring out, with everybody's help, this man who, along with others, has dignified and validated an artistic pursuit that for so long has been considered closeted, a secret vice, a vice, secret, a pathological, and has in some ways given it importance. And I think that this is an important.
And I've created a number of languages for different television shows. In the community, we call them conlangs. Conlang is short for constructed language, and it came out of the necessity for having a name for the listserv that was short. They said, well, it needs to be something at wherever it was going to be, and it needs to be a short word. They said, well, conlang, it's short for constructed language, and now it's in the Oxford English Dictionary. Crazy. Anyway, so I've created languages for Game of Thrones. I've created these guys, Dothraki, Valyrian, and I created a language for one line for this giant in season 5. I didn't know it was going to be that little. I thought it was going to be more, and it was funny. Even though it was only one line, one short line that I translated, they still cut it down. It was great. Anyway, so I also created languages for a show called Defiance, which is sadly canceled after 3 seasons. Anybody remember Defiance here? Oh, yay. You guys are awesome. I loved working on this show. Part of the reason is that they let me do so much stuff with it. Like they let me create writing systems that they used all over the place. They used on signage in the background. They used in a journal, which then the journal pages got sold afterwards when the show was canceled and it was put up on eBay. And so I bought them. I was like, I don't care. It's $330 well spent. I also created a language for a show called Star-Crossed. This is all in chronological order, by the way. It was a language called Sondive. It needed to be for young, sexy teens, so I gave it nasalized vowels like in French. Anybody watch Star-Crossed? Wow, really? Hey, all right. It was pretty cool for one season. I created a language for Thor: The Dark World. I didn't actually create this script for the movie. I created it for the one fan of this language. There's like one fan. She was on
Irish legends, along with the magical powers of the Celtic poet, has driven her to study fantasy worlds and languages both medieval and modern. She edited and translated the divine language created by the 12th century nun, Saint Hildegard of Bingen, and in stolen hours, years ago, she wrote a teleplay to Star Trek, The Next Generation. Hollow Pursuits was about a shy lieutenant who recreated his fellow officers in that other world called the holodeck. And as luck would have it, she spent 3 years making animated films in an online virtual world, a new media holodeck. She shares with David Peterson an avid interest in linguistics and language invention. Sarah will be introducing our speaker tonight, and I'll turn it over to Sarah.
How's my sound? Thank you so much, Marianne, for that lovely introduction. I'm embarrassed now. It was a fortuitous conflict that brought 2 terrific sponsors together for me. I'm delighted to have the support of the Neely sponsors who joined forces with the Humanities Project in funding and helping me put this event together. Especially Marianne, Katie Festa, Marie Turner, Izzy Levin, Matt Balichet, and Joan Rubin of the Humanities Center, and of course Jenny Gilardoni and Sherry Gunter for helping me with the technicalities of this. I also want to thank my former student, Sarah Nainzadeh, whom you mentioned, yes, who gave me a grant some time ago that I've long wanted to share with the university, and now I can do so. And thank you all for coming. David Peterson's visit today is part of a three-pronged project I conceived of last year. There is a documentary coming out later this year, directed by Britton Watkins and Joshua Feldman, about personal and artistic language invention, for which I was interviewed, and where I talked to David in Brooklyn when I did so. Step that we've made today in honoring it in this way. So David's going to speak to us today about new media linguistics, inventing languages for more than just Game of Thrones. And as they say in Dothraki, vo levos hat chrazef. Don't tie your horse down. So don't tie it down. Be what you can be. David Peterson.
All right, let's see if this thing works. Does it? Yes. Really? Like it's actually projecting me? Everybody hear me in the back? Cool. Even in the very, very, very back, the people I see on the wall. Yay! Oh, wait, you say so? Okay, hold on a sec. I think I can work with that. Just a second. Just 1 second. The button is not very sensitive. Wait a minute. Is it working now? Oh my God, yes. All right, cool. So, yeah, let's start this thing going here. I do kind of a fancy thing. Also, I have to remember to look to my left, not my right. So I'm going to stay on this side of the room so everybody gets the mic. Anyway, so there, it's coming. All right. There's the title now that's done, and we can stop thinking about it because I don't know what it means. This is me. That's me over there. That's my grandfather. That's my cousin. It looks like my sister, but it's not. My sister is actually 20 years younger than me. Pretty wild. My only sister, my only sibling, she's a high school freshman right now. Oh man, I wish that I should have put up a picture of her so I can embarrass her. Anyway, her name is Natalie Ishii, so that will embarrass her. Hopefully this will come out on the internet and she will cringe. I love it. I love it. She's in high school. She's so embarrassable. Anyway, so yeah, so that's me.